32 minutes. That is how long it took, on the night of August 9, 1942, for a Japanese cruiser force to sink 4 Allied heavy cruisers off a jungle island most Americans had never heard of. 4 warships, more than 30,000 tons of steel, gone to the bottom of a channel that sailors would soon call Iron Bottom Sound. Over 1,000 men dead before the sun came up. The Japanese admiral who did it lost 58 men and not a single ship. He turned his force around in the dark and steamed home, almost untouched. This was the United States Navy at the start of its war in the Pacific. 8 months after Pearl Harbor, the Navy that would one day rule 2 oceans got caught flat-footed in the dark and paid for it in blood and burning cruisers. It was the worst open sea beating the U.S. Navy ever took. And here is the part that stayed hidden. The Navy did not tell the American public the truth for weeks. So how did it happen? How did 7 Japanese ships walk right through 2 lines of Allied warships and cut them apart before most of the crews even knew a battle had started? To understand that night, you have to back up 3 days, to the first American offensive of the entire war. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines waded ashore on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. It was the first time American troops had gone on the attack anywhere against Japan. The 1st Marine Division, about 11,000 men under Major General Alexander Vandegrift, hit the beach to grab an airfield the Japanese were building. Whoever held that airfield controlled the skies over the southern Solomons, and whoever held the skies could choke the sea lanes to Australia. The Marines took the strip fast and named it Henderson Field, after a Marine pilot killed at Midway. Taking it was the easy part. Holding it turned into 6 months of hell. The problem was simple. The Marines were ashore, but everything they needed to survive was still on the transport ships anchored off the beach. Ammunition, food, sandbags, artillery, the bulldozers to finish the airfield. All of it floating in the water, being unloaded slowly by exhausted men. And those transports needed protection. So the Allied Navy parked a screening force of cruisers and destroyers around the anchorage to guard against a Japanese counterpunch from the sea. Everyone knew the Japanese would come. Nobody guessed how fast, or how hard. It helps to know what kind of ships were sitting in that water, because the American cruisers off Savo were not old relics. The Vincennes, the Quincy, and the Astoria were New Orleans-class heavy cruisers, laid down in the early 1930s and commissioned in the mid-1930s. They were the pride of the treaty era, built inside the tonnage limits the Washington and London naval treaties forced on every major navy. 9 8-inch guns, each in 3 triple turrets, a design speed north of 32 knots, armor thin enough to keep them under the treaty ceiling. The Australian ships had their own pedigree. Canberra was a county-class heavy cruiser built in Britain in the 1920s, a tall, handsome ship with 3 funnels and a reputation as a steady seaboat. These were not throwaway hulls. Each one had cost a fortune, carried a crew of the better part of 1,000 men, and represented years of a nation's shipyard labor. Losing 4 of them in half an hour was not just a tactical defeat. It was the sudden erasure of a decade of naval investment. The man in overall command afloat was British, Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley of the Royal Australian Navy, flying his flag in the heavy cruiser Hamas Australia. Crutchley was no armchair officer. He had won the Victoria Cross in the First World War, the highest decoration the British Empire could give, for actions during the raids on the Belgian coast. He was a fighting sailor, put in charge of a screen that was about to be shredded through no lack of nerve on his part. Under him, the screening cruisers were split into groups to cover the approaches. Between Guadalcanal and the smaller island of Florida sat a fat volcanic cone called Savo Island, and it split the western entrance into two channels, a northern one and a southern one. Crutchley put a southern group and a northern group to guard those two doors. The southern force had the Australian cruisers Australia and Canberra, and the American heavy cruiser USS Chicago, screened by destroyers. The northern force had three American heavy cruisers, the Vincennes, the Astoria, and the Quincy, steaming in a slow box patrol. Off to the west, picket destroyers with radar were supposed to be the tripwire, the first warning if anything came down the slot from the northwest. That was the wall. On paper, it looked strong. 6 heavy cruisers and a screen of destroyers, radar-equipped, guarding a narrow sea. What could get through that? Keep that question in your head, because the answer was already at sea, steaming south at 24 knots, with a very different idea about how to fight at night. His name was Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa. When word reached Rabaul that the Americans had landed on Guadalcanal, Mikawa did not wait for orders from Tokyo or for a careful plan. He scraped together every warship he could find in a matter of hours. His flagship was the heavy cruiser Chokai, a Takao-class ship bristling with 10 8-inch guns and, more to the point, banks of torpedo tubes that his American counterparts did not carry. Behind her came 4 more heavy cruisers, the Aoba, the Kako, the Kinugasa, and the Furutaka, plus 2 light cruisers, the Tenryu and the Yubari, and a lone destroyer, the Unagi. The 4 heavy cruisers behind Chokai were older ships from the 1920s, smaller than the American New Orleans class, but every one of them had been built and drilled around a single idea, the massed night torpedo attack. 7 cruisers and 1 tin can, thrown together and pointed straight at the American beachhead 500 miles away. Mikawa's plan was blunt. Run down the slot at night, get in among the transports, and sink everything he could reach before the sun came up and American planes could hunt him. Here is where the two navies split apart, and here is the whole story in one idea. The Americans thought about night the way most navies did in 1942. Night was for caution. You slowed down, you kept station, you waited for radar to sort out the picture, and you hoped to survive until daylight when your air power took over. The Japanese thought about night the exact opposite way. For years, all through the 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy had drilled night fighting harder than any fleet on Earth. They knew from cold arithmetic that they would never match the United States in the number of ships or the tonnage of steel, so they built a doctrine to beat a bigger enemy in the dark, one violent engagement at a time. They trained their lookouts to see in the dark like cats, gave them huge night binoculars, some of them mounting lenses over 8 inches across, and rehearsed torpedo attacks over and over until a night ambush was second nature. Officers were selected and promoted partly on how well they handled these night actions in fleet exercises. To Mikawa, darkness was not a danger, it was a weapon. And he was carrying the single deadliest naval weapon in the Pacific, and almost nobody on the American side knew it existed yet. That weapon was the Type 93 torpedo. History remembers it as the Long Lance, a name coined after the war by an American historian who wanted to capture its reach. The Japanese had started developing it in the early 1930s, working the dangerous problem of running a torpedo on pure oxygen, when other navies had tried and given up because oxygen tended to blow up the workshop. Japanese engineers solved the handling problem and put the weapon into service in 1935, then kept it one of the best guarded secrets in their navy. Compare it to what the Americans were shooting and your stomach drops. The standard U.S. destroyer torpedo of 1942, the Mark 15, ran maybe 6,000 yards at high speed and carried a warhead that often failed to explode when it hit. The Japanese Long Lance ran on that pure oxygen instead of compressed air. It could travel more than 20,000 yards, over 11 miles, at high speed, and it carried a warhead of roughly 1,000 pounds of explosive, nearly double the punch of the American fish. It left almost no wake, because oxygen leaves no telltale trail of bubbles the way compressed air does. So a Japanese cruiser could fire a spread of these things from far out in the dark, and the first warning the target got was the water erupting under its hull. American sailors that year kept reporting that they had hit a mine or been struck by a submarine, because they could not believe a surface ship had reached out and killed them from that far away in the dark. Now put those two navies on a collision course in a black channel with no moon. On the afternoon of August 8th, an Australian scout plane spotted part of Mikawa's force coming down the slot. The pilot reported it. But the report was garbled and slow, and worse, it described the ships in a way that made them sound like they might be seaplane tenders, not a strike force. Seaplane tenders are support ships. They do not charge a beachhead at night. So the warning that could have saved 4 cruisers got filed as something to worry about tomorrow, not something bearing down on them tonight. The Allied commanders read it and concluded no surface attack was likely before morning. Mikawa, meanwhile, launched his own scout planes, and by evening he knew almost exactly where the Allied cruisers were sitting. His float planes even flew over the anchorage with running lights on, and the Allied ships below assumed they were friendly. The enemy was studying them from the air, and they waved it off. The Allied side was worn out. The men had been at general quarters for the better part of 2 days, fighting off Japanese air raids from Rabaul while trying to unload the transports. Crews were dead on their feet, and on that same evening, the American carrier commander covering the operation, Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, decided to pull his carriers back to refuel and to save them from air attack. When the carriers left, the transports lost their air cover, which meant they had to finish unloading and leave sooner, which meant the whole operation was already unraveling. That night, Admiral Crutchley was called away in his flagship Australia to a conference with the amphibious commander, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. So the strongest cruiser in the southern group physically steamed away from the battle line for a meeting, and command of that group passed to the captain of the Chicago, who was not told he was now in charge of anything larger than his own ship. Little things. Fatigue, a confusing scout report, a flagship pulled out of line, a carrier commander heading for safer water. None of them alone would have mattered. Stacked together in the dark, they built the trap. Mikawa ran in at high speed. He passed his own lookout warning down the line. "Sailors, do your utmost." His column threaded toward the southern channel, between Savo Island and Guadalcanal, in a long single file, with the flagship Chokai in the lead. Somewhere ahead of him in the dark sat 2 American picket destroyers, the Blue and the Ralph Talbot, the tripwire, the whole reason the Allies felt safe. Both had radar. Both were the early warning system, and both missed him completely. The Blue was steaming slowly away from the gap at the exact moment Mikawa's column slipped through, her radar screen fogged by the landmass of Savo behind the ships. Japanese lookouts on Chokai actually spotted the Blue and trained their guns on her, ready to blow her out of the water. The destroyer just kept plodding along, oblivious, and turned away. Mikawa let her go rather than give himself away with gunfire. His 7 cruisers glided past the tripwire, and it never went off. At about 1:36 in the morning on August 9th, Japanese lookouts saw the Southern Allied group ahead, the Canberra and the Chicago, and their destroyers, dark shapes against the faint glow. Mikawa gave the order. Long lance torpedoes hissed into the water, star shells and searchlights snapped on, and the southern group, which had no idea an enemy was within 20 miles, suddenly found itself lit up and under fire from point-blank range. The Australian cruiser Canberra took it first and worst. She was turning to bring her guns to bear when the Japanese salvos found her. In the space of a couple of minutes, she was hit by dozens of shells and at least one, maybe two torpedoes. Both boiler rooms were wrecked. Her captain, Frank Getting, was mortally wounded on the bridge but refused to be treated ahead of his own sailors, telling the medical team to see to the other wounded men first. He died of his wounds. She lost power almost instantly, which meant she could not fight, could not steer, could not even pump water. She rolled to a stop, burning, listing, dead in the water, before she had fired a meaningful shot in her own defense. 84 of her men were killed. She would be scuttled by an American destroyer the next morning, because she could not be saved, her fires still burning as she went under. The USS Chicago was next. A torpedo tore into her bow and blew part of it off. Confused, half-blinded, her captain, Howard Bode, took her off to the west chasing gun flashes, and in doing so he steamed away from the battle and away from the northern group he might have warned. Chicago survived the night, but she contributed almost nothing to the fight, and she failed to send a clear contact report to the 3 cruisers still sitting up north with no clue what was coming. That silence would be lethal, and it would follow Captain Bode for the rest of his short life. Because here is the thing about Mikawa's run. Having smashed the southern group in a few violent minutes, his column split into 2 loose lines and swung north, and now the whole thing was about to happen a second time, to a fresh set of victims who had heard the gunfire, seen the glow on the horizon, and still not understood what it meant. Word had not reached them. The men of the northern group saw flashes to the south, and assumed it was something being handled, maybe a nervous destroyer shooting at shadows. Nobody told them a Japanese battle force was loose inside the screen and headed their way. So they kept up their slow, peaceful box patrol at 10 knots, guns trained fore and aft, many of the crew asleep at their stations. And out of the dark came the searchlights again. The 3 American heavy cruisers up north were the Vincennes, the Quincy, and the Astoria. Good ships. 8-inch guns, thousands of tons of American steel, crews of over 900 men each, and in the next 20 minutes, all 3 of them would be turned into burning wrecks. This is the part the Navy did not want printed in the papers back home. The Astoria was hit first among the 3. When the searchlights found her, her gunnery officer opened fire on his own initiative, which was the right instinct. Her captain, William Greenman, freshly woken, briefly ordered a ceasefire because in the chaos he was afraid they might be shooting at friendly ships. That pause, understandable and human, cost the Astoria precious seconds she did not have. The Japanese cruisers had no such doubt. They knew exactly who they were shooting at. Shell after shell walked up the Astoria, wrecking her upper works, setting her aircraft and her hangar ablaze, knocking out her guns 1 turret at a time. She fought back, and she actually landed a hit on Mikawa's flagship Chokai, a single 8-inch shell that struck near the Admiral's chart room and killed several of his staff. A few feet different, and it might have killed Mikawa himself. Down in the burning wreck, a small group of the Astoria's men kept the No. 2 turret in action by hand long after the power failed, passing shells up by muscle in a compartment filling with smoke. But the fires on the Astoria spread faster than her crew could fight them. She burned through the rest of the night, and a salvage effort the next day almost saved her before the flooding won. She finally rolled over and sank in the afternoon. She lost about 219 men. The Quincy caught the worst of it, because she got caught between 2 Japanese lines and was shot from both sides at once. Crossfire. She was lit up, hammered by cruisers to port and to starboard, and her crew fought back with a fury that did not save them. She did manage one thing that mattered. A single salvo from the Quincy slammed into Mikawa's flagship Chokai and hit the operations room. It was the closest the Americans came all night to decapitating the enemy. But the Quincy was already finished. Her bridge took a direct hit that killed almost everyone on it, including her captain, Samuel Moore. A wounded officer found the dying navigator, Lieutenant Commander John Andrew, propped against the wreckage, and asked what to do. The story that came down from the survivors is that the navigator's last order was to beach the ship on Savo Island, so at least some of the crew might live. There was no way to obey it. The Quincy had no power and no steering left. She went down bow first, around 2:38 in the morning, the first of the three to sink, taking about 370 of her men with her. She may have been the first ship ever to sink into what would become Iron Bottom Sound, and she was very far from the last. The Vincennes was the flagship of the northern group, under Captain Frederick Reefcoal. When the shooting started to the south, he could not make sense of it. When the searchlights found his own ship, he thought at first they might be friendly, and ordered his lights turned on to identify himself, which only made him an easier target. The Japanese fire that fell on the Vincennes was overwhelming. She was hit by scores of shells and at least 2, probably 3 torpedoes. One of her turrets got off a salvo that reached the Kinugasa, a small answer in a one-sided beating. Her boiler rooms flooded. Her guns went silent one by one, and fire took the rest. Captain Reefcoal gave the order to abandon ship as she settled. The Vincennes sank about 2:50 in the morning. She lost 332 men. Stop and add it up, because the arithmetic is the story. Canberra, wrecked and scuttled. Astoria, burning and sunk. Quincy, sunk. Vincennes, sunk. 4 Allied heavy cruisers destroyed. Chicago, crippled. Over 1,000 Allied sailors killed in a single night, most of them in the span of about half an hour. And on the other side, Mikawa's flagship took a few hits. One of his cruisers took minor damage. 58 Japanese sailors dead. Not one Japanese ship lost that night. In terms of ships sunk against ships lost, it is the most lopsided open-water defeat the United States Navy has ever suffered. Not one of the worst. The worst. If you love this kind of concrete, hard numbers naval history, do me one favor and tap subscribe. It is the single biggest thing that helps this channel keep making these deep dives, and it costs you nothing. Now, let me tell you the part that turns a defeat into a scandal, because Mikawa's night was not actually over, and what he did next is one of the strangest command decisions of the whole Pacific War. Here is what should terrify you if you were an American that night. The 4 cruisers were never the real target. They were the guards at the door. Behind them, packed into the anchorage off Guadalcanal, sat the transports. Dozens of them, loaded with the supplies and the men of the 1st Marine Division, sitting still in the water, almost defenseless now that their screen was burning. Mikawa had smashed the guards. The vault was wide open. If he had pressed on for another hour, he could have steamed into that anchorage and slaughtered the transports one by one, and without their supplies, the Marines ashore on Guadalcanal might have been doomed. The entire American offensive, the first offensive of the war, hung on what Mikawa did in the next few minutes, and he turned around. He gathered his scattered column and steamed back up the slot toward Rabaul, leaving the transports untouched. Because his ships had gotten strung out and mixed up in the fighting, and it would take time to reform them for an attack on the anchorage. Because his ships had fired off most of their torpedoes, and reloading those heavy tubes in the dark took time he did not think he had. because he was worried about those American carriers. He did not know Fletcher had pulled them back. He assumed they were close, and he knew that if daylight caught his cruisers anywhere near Guadalcanal, American dive bombers would sink them in the open sea with no air cover of his own. So he chose the sure thing: bank the huge victory he already had and run for home before dawn. It was a cautious call by a man who had just fought one of the boldest actions of the war, and it may have saved the American campaign. Because those transports lived, the Marines got at least some of their supplies, and Guadalcanal held. 6 months later, the whole island would be American. There is a grim footnote that softened the blow just a little. On the way home, one of Mikawa's own heavy cruisers, the Kako, was caught on August 10th by the American submarine S-44 near Cavite. The S-44 was an old boat launched back in 1923, one of the tired little submarines the Navy had left over from the previous decade. Her skipper, Lieutenant Commander John Moore, held his fire until the range was almost point blank and put a spread of 4 torpedoes into the Kako. She rolled over and sank in about 5 minutes, taking 71 of her crew with her. It was a small, sharp piece of revenge, and it was a preview of the American torpedo campaign that would eventually strangle Japan. But one cruiser lost to a submarine 2 days later did nothing to change the ledger of that night. The Battle of Savo Island was a catastrophe for the United States Navy, and everyone who knew the numbers knew it. So the Navy did what wounded institutions sometimes do: it buried the bad news. The American public was in a fragile mood in the summer of 1942. Pearl Harbor was still an open wound. Midway in June had finally given the country something to cheer about. And now, just 2 months later, the Navy had lost 4 cruisers in half an hour to a force that skated away almost untouched. The Navy Department did not release the full truth right away. For weeks, the losses were softened, delayed, and folded into vaguer accounts of the fighting in the Solomons. The families of the dead were notified, but the scale of the disaster and the way it happened were kept quiet while the campaign for Guadalcanal was still in doubt. It was months before the full picture reached the American public. The Navy did eventually run an official investigation, led by Admiral Arthur Hepburn, and that inquiry spread the blame around without hanging it on any one officer, in part because so many of the men who might have been blamed were dead, and in part because the Navy did not want to gut the morale of a fleet that was still fighting for its life in those same waters. Only one officer was singled out for serious criticism: Captain Bode of the Chicago, the man who had steamed the wrong way and failed to pass the alarm. When Bode learned that the Hepburn report was going to point at him, he shot himself in his quarters in Balboa, Panama, in April 1943, and died the next day. Savo Island claimed him too, 8 months late. Now peel back the excuses and ask the real question: why did it happen? Not the small stuff, the tired crews and the garbled scout report, the deep reasons. There were 3, and every one of them got paid for in the months that followed. The first was doctrine. The U.S. Navy in 1942 did not know how to fight at night, and the Imperial Japanese Navy did. The Americans had spent their peacetime training on daylight gunnery duels at long range, big ships slugging it out under the sun the way they imagined a fleet battle would look. Their war plans, the famous War Plan Orange studies drawn up between the wars, pictured a grand daylight clash of battle lines somewhere in the Central Pacific, not a knife fight in a black channel. The Japanese had spent a decade training for exactly the kind of close-range night action that Savo turned out to be. They had even built their fleet around it, packing torpedo tubes onto cruisers that the Americans left off theirs, because American designers thought big ship torpedoes were a fire hazard not worth the tonnage. When the two doctrines met in the dark, The side that had rehearsed it butchered the side that had not. It was not that American sailors were braver or less brave. It was that they had been trained for the wrong fight. The second reason was the torpedo, and it cut two ways. The long lance gave the Japanese a reach the Americans did not know to fear, so American captains parked their cruisers inside a kill zone they did not know existed. Meanwhile, American torpedoes in 1942 were, frankly, junk. The Mark 14 and Mark 15 ran too deep, and their magnetic exploders and contact pistols failed constantly. American submarines and destroyers spent the first 2 years of the war watching torpedoes bounce off enemy hulls or run harmlessly under them. The Bureau of Ordnance had never properly tested the weapons before the war, because live torpedoes were expensive, so the flaws only showed up in combat, where they cost lives and ships. So even when the U.S. Navy did get a shot, its main ship-killing weapon often did not work. That scandal, the Great American Torpedo Failure, took until 1943 to fix, and it is a whole story on its own. The third reason was radar, and this is the bitter irony of Savo Island. The Americans had radar. The Japanese at this stage largely did not. Radar was supposed to be the American edge, the machine that would let them see in the dark the way Japanese lookouts saw with their trained eyes and giant binoculars. And at Savo, the radar failed them. The early SC radar sets on some of the cruisers were unreliable and easily confused by nearby land, and Savo Island itself masked the incoming ships. The picket destroyers with radar were out of position or looking the wrong way. Crews did not yet fully trust the sets or know how to read them in a crowded, mountainous seascape, and there was no clear doctrine yet for how a radar contact should be reported and acted on across a whole task force. The Americans held a war-winning technology in their hands, and, on that night, they did not know how to use it. That is the hardest lesson of all, because it is not about courage or steel, it is about learning. And learn they did. This is the turn in the story, the reason Savo Island matters beyond the tragedy. The U.S. Navy took that beating, studied it, and changed. Over the next year, the Americans fought battle after battle in those same waters, and slowly, the lessons of Savo got hammered into doctrine. At the Battle of Cape Esperance in October 1942, an American force under Rear Admiral Norman Scott used its radar to cross the Japanese T and, for once, ambush the ambushers, sinking a cruiser and a destroyer. It was a rough, confused fight, and the Americans got some of it wrong, firing on their own destroyers in the muddle. But it was proof the tables could turn. In November came the vicious night surface battles for Guadalcanal itself, where American cruisers and destroyers traded punches with Japanese battleships at point-blank range and paid a terrible price but stopped the enemy from smashing Henderson Field. Admirals Scott and Daniel Callahan were both killed in one night of that fighting, and Callahan's flagship, the San Francisco, took her bridge apart in a duel with a battleship at a range where the guns could barely miss. Then came the men who truly cracked the code. By 1943, officers like Arleigh Burke and Frederick Moosbrugger had figured out how to fight the Japanese night attack and beat it. Burke, who earned the nickname 31-knot Burke for the speed he drove his destroyers, preached a simple gospel. Fire your torpedoes first from the dark, keep your guns quiet until the fish hit, and only then light up the enemy. The recipe was radar plus torpedoes plus surprise, used the way the Japanese had used them at Savo. At the Battle of Vella Gulf in August 1943, 1 year almost to the night after Savo, Moosbrugger's destroyers used radar to detect a Japanese force before it knew they were there, fired a massive torpedo spread from the dark, and sank 3 Japanese destroyers in minutes without losing a single American ship. It was Savo Island in reverse. the student had become the master. The Americans had taken the exact tactics that were used to butcher them off Savo and turned those tactics back on the men who invented them. A few months later at Cape St. George, Burke did the same thing again, wiping out a Japanese destroyer force and steaming home without a scratch. That is the real legacy of the 4 cruisers lost off Savo Island. They were the tuition. The U.S. Navy paid an ugly price in one night to learn a lesson it could not have learned any other way. That night fighting was a science, that radar had to be trusted and mastered, that torpedoes had to work, that a tired crew and a garbled report and a flag officer pulled out of line could add up to 1,000 dead men. The Navy that got humiliated at Savo in August 1942 became, within a year, the most dangerous night-fighting fleet on the planet. And within 3 years, that same Navy would stand in Tokyo Bay while Japan signed the surrender. Think about the scale of what American industry did in that stretch, because it is the other half of why Savo did not lose the war. The 4 heavy cruisers lost at Savo were replaced many times over. American shipyards in the war launched cruisers, destroyers, and escort carriers at a rate no nation had ever matched. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States built well over 1,000 major warships, including 24 fleet and light carriers of the Essex and Independence classes, and more than 100 small escort carriers on top of that. The Essex-class fleet carriers came off the ways one after another, a new one joining the fleet roughly every couple of months at the peak. American yards turned out destroyers by the hundred, and turned out the cheap, tough escort carriers so fast that sailors joked they were being stamped out like cars. By 1944, the U.S. Navy was so large it could afford to lose ships that would have been irreplaceable disasters in 1942. Japan, by comparison, finished the entire war having built a small fraction of that tonnage, and the Kako and the other ships Mikawa took to Rabaul could never be replaced on anything like the same timetable. That is the deeper American story hiding inside Savo Island. The country could take a punch that would have crippled a smaller nation, learn from it, and come back with a fleet 10 times the size. Mikawa won the battle off Savo. He could not win the war, because behind those 4 burning cruisers stood a shipbuilding machine that would drown the Imperial Japanese Navy in steel. The aftermath reached the men and the ships of Mikawa's own force too, and the war was not kind to them. Within 2 years, most of the cruisers that had run down the slot that night were on the bottom themselves. The Furutaka went down at Cape Esperance that same October. The Kinugasa was sunk by American aircraft in November 1942. The Aoba was bombed to pieces in her home waters by war's end. The mighty Chokai, Mikawa's flagship, was destroyed at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944. The very ships that had carried out the most one-sided victory of the surface war were hunted down and killed by the fleet they had humiliated, one by one, in the 2 years that followed. The men who survived that hunt went home to a defeated country. There is one more thing worth sitting with. The channel where those ships went down earned its nickname honestly. Iron Bottom Sound holds the wrecks of dozens of warships, American, Australian, and Japanese, sunk in the half-year of fighting for Guadalcanal. Divers and researchers, including the oceanographer Robert Ballard, who found the Titanic and the Bismarck, have gone down into that dark water and located the Quincy, the Vincennes, the Astoria, and the Canberra, still where they fell that night in August 1942, sitting upright or rolled on their sides in the silt, with their guns still trained out toward an enemy they never saw. For the men who served in those waters, that patch of sea was a graveyard they never forgot. More than 1,000 Allied sailors died at Savo Island in about half an hour, most of them so fast they never understood what hit them. They deserve to be remembered not as a defeat the Navy tried to hide, but as the men whose loss taught the fleet how to win. Gunichi Mikawa is a strange figure to end on. He fought one of the most brilliant tactical actions of the entire Pacific War, and is remembered mostly for the mistake he made after it, turning away from the transports. Naval historians have argued for 80 years about whether he was right to run for home. Some say he threw away the chance to cripple the whole American campaign, that a bolder admiral would have finished the transports and starved the Marines off Guadalcanal. Others say that if he had lingered, American planes would have caught his cruisers in daylight and sunk the lot, and his victory would have died with them. Even the Japanese high command was divided, praising the win in public, while privately grumbling that he had left the job half done. What is not in dispute is what he did in those 32 minutes in the dark. He gave the United States Navy the worst open sea beating in its history, and he did it clean. So the next time you hear the U.S. Navy called the most powerful fleet the world has ever seen, remember that it was not born that way. It was forged. Part of that forging happened on one black night off a jungle island, when 4 cruisers burned and sank and a proud service learned, the hard way, everything it did not know. The Navy that ruled the Pacific by 1945 was built on the bones of the ships in Iron Bottom Sound. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel is for, so take 1 second and hit subscribe. It genuinely is the biggest thing that helps these videos reach more people who love real history told straight. And if the Long Lance torpedo caught your attention, that oxygen-powered killer that outranged everything the Americans had, that is the weapon at the center of my next deep dive. How one torpedo let a smaller Navy punch far above its weight for 2 years, and how American engineers finally beat it. Stick around, because that story explains half of everything that went wrong for the U.S. Navy in 1942, and I will see you in the next one.